Can you just firstly remind our viewers on why you felt you had to resign from your post?
Well, mine was a little bit different from Lord Geidt, although Lord Geidt, I think, has since agreed with me with his resignation letter. What I was saying was that when the Prime Minister responded to the Sue Gray report, he was urged to come up with a reply which addressed whether or not the Sue Gray report said that he'd broken the ministerial code or not. And he was very, very focused on whether or not he'd broken the ministerial code by being issued with a fixed penalty notice, if you remember, by the police. Didn't really address the main criticism in the Sue Gray report, which was the failure of leadership, as Sue Gray described it, as the report said. And of course, leadership at number 10, the culture, the organisation that allowed all those parties to happen, is one of the central 7 principles of integrity in public life. They're called the Nolan principles. They run like a stick of rock right the way through the middle of the ministerial code. And it was pretty hard, I thought, to conclude that the Prime Minister wasn't being criticised for breaking the ministerial code. And when he didn't really address that, I just felt I had to go. But I'm very sorry that it came to that. Obviously, it wasn't a decision which I took very lightly, but that was my reason. And I think that Lord Geidt actually backed it up. It's one of the points he made in his letter when he resigned earlier on this week.
You say that, Lord Geidt, you felt backed up that principle, but to be honest, I think most people would find it a bit more easy to get their heads around, I guess, if Lord Geidt had resigned for the reasons that you did. You know, he didn't go over the parties at number 10 or over the flat refurbishment. Instead, it seemed like he decided to quit after a request for advice about tariffs on Chinese steel. I mean, it doesn't really feel like a smoking gun, does it?
Well, and that's been the sort of the big open question. You're absolutely right. I mean, everyone's been reading his letter. He's since published a further clarification, but there's an awful lot of missing details about precisely what it was that he was being asked to opine on. And so that's still sort of an open question, which I think people will still be looking for answers for, because no one can quite understand why a trade deal might involve a breach of the ministerial code or not. So that's still an outstanding and an open question, which we don't know the answer to yet.
Do you think that really, part of the reason that he went is because of a build-up, I guess, over things like the ministerial code and how it applies to Partygate and receiving that fine?
It was pretty clear from his letter, yes, that this was, if you like, the final straw that broke the camel's back, and that he'd been sort of getting more and more uncomfortable over time. One of the things that made him uncomfortable, as I said, was the reason why I resigned about a week earlier. But ultimately, we will have to see whether or not there's any more clarification he can offer, or indeed whether or not Parliament wants to see what it was that he was being asked to opine on. But we'll have to wait and see about that one. As you say, still many questions to be answered, I think.
Now, one of the reasons I was keen to talk to you about this subject today is because it feels as if number 10, well, they have said that they're now reviewing the post of ethics advisor in its entirety. Do you think they might scrap it?
Well, I hope they won't. I think that the ethics advisor does something really important. And while it's quite possible you do need to update and upgrade and modernise these things every once in a while, it's quite possible to amend it a bit. I think that if they do anything other than strengthen it, then I think that they will lose a lot of credibility, and they will also miss out on a job that urgently needs to be done. I think the last few months clearly demonstrate that it has to happen. So, yes, there are a couple of things they could do to improve it, to strengthen it, to modernise it, but scrapping it is not part of that.
Do you think that part of it might be driven for the fact that it might be quite difficult to get anybody to do the job?
Well,
We've lost 2 ethics advisors now.
Well, I think that there will be an issue with finding somebody, yes. But I think that if they strengthen the role, I've made a couple of suggestions about how that might happen. It becomes more doable if you make it stronger, and therefore it will become, I think, more attractive to the kind of sturdily independent, high caliber person they're going to need to have to give the role credibility, and therefore to sort of restore the credibility in this area of the ministerial code and of number 10. So yes, it can be done. But they'll need to strengthen it in order to make it attractive to the right kind of person.
The right kind of person being someone who will stand up to Boris Johnson, is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. And not just to Boris Johnson. The whole point about this role is that they need to be willing to stand up to any Prime Minister, whoever they may be, Boris Johnson or any of his successors over the next 10, 20, 30 years. You've got to have somebody who isn't afraid to speak truth to power.
Now, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the confidence motion. 148 MPs, of course, voting to say they had no confidence in the Prime Minister. We heard from Grant Shapps earlier on the programme, who quite interestingly said he predicted that number and was just one out in his prediction, which is quite remarkable, actually. But he was making the point that he thinks now most people want everyone to move on, for the Prime Minister to focus on doing the job, looking at the situation in Ukraine, etc. Is that analysis correct, or do you think that a significant number of Conservative MPs are still harbouring those concerns about his leadership?
Well, I think that by winning the vote, even though I'm sure he would have wanted to win it but much more handily and with a bigger margin, but by winning the vote, I think the Prime Minister has won himself a bit of time. And people like me and others, we have to respect the result of that vote. We have to accept it and respect it. And I think everybody does. And that means that the Prime Minister's got a little bit of time to deliver the reset that he's already said he wants to do. He knows he's got to build some, rebuild some bridges, if you like. So he said he wants to do that. And I think that's entirely the right thing for him to do. But I don't think that rebuilding bridges will just involve ignoring the issue, because I don't think ethics works that way. I don't think that integrity works that way. I think you've got to show that you're changing what you're doing and you're changing how you do it in order to address the concerns. You can't just ignore them and pretend it didn't happen.
The Mail on Sunday are reporting today that some MPs are looking at potentially changing the rules around confidence motions so that another one could be held after 6 months. Is that correct?
Well, I think that would be a decision for Sir Graham Brady, who runs the 1922 committee, which is kind of like the trade union, if you like, for Conservative MPs. My guess is that what he would say, I think he's actually said this publicly, is that there's not much point in changing the rules unless it's quite likely that another vote would come up with a different result. So I think it would require quite a lot of Conservative MPs who voted in favour of the Prime Minister in the last vote to come to him privately and say, look, I've changed my mind. And only at that point it would make very much sense. Otherwise, you're just sort of going through sort of party constitutional hoops for no very good practical purpose. And what's the point of that?
But it would be possible to do if enough Conservative MPs indicated that they'd like to see another one.
Well, at that point, there's a process and there'd have to be a vote and stuff like that. But yes, you could do it. But I think that everyone is playing that one quite carefully and not wanting to sort of fan the flames of that idea, just because there's not much point. If the reset works, if the Prime Minister persuades people, if he rebuilds the bridges that he said he wants to do, then it all becomes a bit sort of a theoretical argument, I think is the point.
OK, that makes sense. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning, John Penrose there.